the fingers. Fourth layer. The fourth layer can consist of quilted pants or overboots. By wearing proper clothing, you have taken the first step in providing shelter for yourself. However, this does not mean you should rely solely on your clothing for shelter. A shelter from the elements needs to be constructed as soon as time and conditions permit. Materials to construct a shelter may be scarce. It is important to keep in mind that if the temperature is below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, shelter other than the aircraft should be sought. This is because the metal in the fuselage will act as a cold sink and draw heat from the body. Natural formations can also shield survivors from the elements. These natural shelters can consist of overhanging ledges, fallen logs, or caves. Another readily available shelter is the life raft. If available, it should be inflated to provide protection from the elements. The raft provides the survivor with an alternative source of shelter, which gives immediate protection from the wind. Other forms of immediate shelter can include an emergency poncho, garbage bags, or a solar blanket. No matter what type of shelter is used, here are a few basic guidelines to remember. Location. Stay near the aircraft. Air rescue parties will be looking for the aircraft and any debris. Look for any possible hazards when selecting a site for shelter. Dead trees could lose their tops or limbs and come crashing down on the shelter. Look for the possibility of an avalanche or rock slide area. Because of the risk of flash floods, stay out of dry stream beds. If possible, place the shelter under a tree line to give added overhead protection from the elements. Material. Many aircraft parts can be used for a shelter. The aircraft's interior has many more resources than the exterior. Fabric on the seats, floors, and walls can be readily used. Natural foliage, such as leaves, grass, and tree boughs, are there for the taking. Snow can also be used as material to build a shelter. Although it is very cold, it makes excellent insulation for existing shelters. Fuel source. Stay near the resources needed to maintain a fire. If there is too much distance between the shelter site and the resources, much needed energy will be expended just to maintain a fire. Water source. Being close to a water source is one primary consideration. Although it is wise to stay close to a water source, do not construct the shelter too close to these areas, as they are typically cooler and damper. Signaling. If possible, select a site that will allow a signal to be seen from all directions. As a general rule, if the site obscures your vision, rescuers won't see you. Remember, the most promising signal is the aircraft wreckage. Keep it visible and stay near it. The effectiveness of any shelter lies in its insulation. As previously mentioned, the best insulation, if available, is snow. But if you have covered the shelter with snow, it is no longer an effective signal. Immediate needs for shelter insulation may outweigh visibility considerations. These factors need to be judged on a case-by-case basis. Once inside the shelter, body heat will begin to warm the shelter. Scraping down to bare earth will increase the inside temperature by about 12 degrees, even if it is sub-zero outside. By lighting a candle, it is possible to raise the temperature by another 4 degrees. Keep the shelter just big enough to accommodate you and your co-survivors. This will make the shelter easier to warm. With adequate shelter and implementation of the other priorities of survival, first aid, water, food, and signaling, you should have a successful survival experience with a minimum of discomfort.
Water covers more than 75% of the Earth's surface. Even though humans have mastered travel over these vast expanses, every day an aircraft has to ditch. If you ever have to ditch, you will be faced with one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Being properly equipped and prepared is the best way to increase your chances for survival. For training purposes, we will concentrate on the hazards that are unique to open water survival. An important fact to remember is that a survival situation begins at the time of an in-flight emergency. Once it is apparent that ditching is inevitable, you should operate as though you are in a survival mode. The main objective is to get the aircraft safely into the water with as little damage as possible. There won't be much planning time, so it's important to consider some what-if situations ahead of time. Each crew member should have a specific task to perform. Use a checklist to ensure that all tasks are completed. A checklist also helps everyone to think and act in a rational and logical manner. A checklist is helpful in any emergency situation, including survival. Before ditching the aircraft, there are some fundamental steps to be considered. Communicate your distress signal early. Don't fall into the trap of denying what is happening to you. Delaying critical decisions like this can decrease your chance of being rescued. As soon as a problem arises, the pilot should report the identification of the aircraft's present position, the nature of the emergency, and the pilot's intentions. Life preservers should be donned before you make contact with the water. All passengers and crew members should be wearing an FAA-certified life preserver. Life vests should not be inflated until evacuation from the aircraft has occurred. Inflating life vests prior to evacuation may puncture the vest while also making it difficult to fit through the emergency exit. So wait until you have completely cleared the exit. It's important that your life vest fit properly. Properly means keeping your head high out of the water. The greatest loss of body heat is through your head and neck. You should also know how to inflate it manually in case the CO2 canister fails. Again, learn this maneuver prior to an emergency situation. The next step is to remove hatches or establish an emergency exit. If you know you are going to crash onto the open water, prop open a door or window or remove a hatch. Once in the water, the pressure may prevent you from opening any exits. Also, upon impact, the airframe may twist and warp. If this happens, doors or hatches may be impossible to remove. All loose items should be stowed. Anything that is not secured could become a projectile. This also means you if you are not wearing a safety restraint. Make sure that you and all crew members are strapped in with the proper safety restraints. Locate and secure survival gear. Secure all survival gear near the emergency exit so you can access it quickly. Before we discuss survival techniques, let's review the principles of successful ditching. Wind direction. With smaller aircraft, wind is a primary consideration. At nighttime, it may be impossible to tell the wind direction. White caps on the ocean will give you some indication. Sea conditions. When ditching an aircraft, look below at the wave patterns on the water's surface. Try to look for the primary swell. Primary swells are described as large swells with some distance between them. Large swells become your primary targets for landing. Land parallel with the swells if you can, and on the top or back side of a swell. At all costs, avoid the face of a swell. You may also see secondary swells. These are created by winds and may run a different direction than the primary swells. Touchdown during ditching should be at the lowest speed possible. It should be a rate of descent that permits safe handling and optimum nose-up attitude on impact. Once impact is made, there is little a pilot can do to control a land plane on the water. If your aircraft has retractable landing gear, keep the gear up and belly skid into the water. Be aware that high-wing or low-wing aircraft with non-retractable gear have a tendency to flip in the water. Because of this, it is important that you maintain a reference point inside the cockpit so you will know where the exit is after impact. This is much more difficult than you may realize. The best way to prepare for this maneuver is to practice it in an aviation dunk trainer. As soon as the aircraft stops, evacuate. Check all crew members and assist any injured. If time and conditions permit, gather as much survival equipment as you can. Next, locate the raft and get it out of the aircraft. The first person out of the aircraft should inflate the raft, making sure it is moored to the plane. Those exiting the aircraft should use the mooring line to get into the raft. This means getting into the water. The raft needs to be away from the aircraft so that it does not become punctured from the metal debris. The mooring line will break away from the aircraft as the aircraft begins to sink. It is best to be moored to the aircraft as long as possible. Once in the raft, ensure that all crew members and passengers are present. There are several basic raft actions that must be accomplished. One individual should assume command. In accordance with international law, the pilot in command will continue to be in command on board the raft unless he or she is injured or prefers to appoint someone else to that leadership role. Retrieve accessory container tied to raft. This container will typically have items to help keep your raft in good repair. A hand pump, repair plugs or patches, a bailing bucket and sponge, a sea anchor, and first aid kit are just a few of the items located in this container. This kit should be closed and tied to the raft. Retrieve hand pump. Keep the raft cells fully inflated, as this will help the raft to be more rigid and stable. Dry the raft using the bailing bucket and sponge. If the inside of the raft gets wet with seawater, it will be very uncomfortable for all the occupants. Bail out as much water as possible using the bailing bucket and dry the raft using the sponge. Inflate the floor. This will make the raft more rigid and stable, as well as providing additional insulation from cooler waters. Check the sea anchor for proper release. A sea anchor will reduce drift and increase stability of the raft. The length of line should be adjusted according to the condition of the seas. Usually, it is best to keep the sea anchor line long. Adjust its length so